We didn't build a fortress to hide in fear. We built it so no one would ever have to live in fear again. Ibrahim Traoré, speaking behind closed doors, now echoing across the continent. In a world where headlines are often louder than the truth, one story slipped quietly past the noise. Burkina Faso, a country long seen as small and far away, has made a decision that surprised almost everyone. And yet, when you listen closely, it begins to make sense. There are reports of 700 highly trained commandos landing in West Africa, not to invade, not to control, but to protect. Protect what exactly? Not just a man, but an idea. That a nation, however small, can choose its own path. That a people, however pressured, can build their own defense. That sovereignty isn't granted by permission, but by preparation. And yes, that preparation has raised questions. Why North Korea? Why now? But maybe the better question is, when a country decides to stand on its own feet, why does that make so many others uncomfortable? If you still believe in justice, not just for one nation, but for all, stay with us, because what you're about to hear won't be found in your evening news. In the center of West Africa lies a country many couldn't find on a map just a few years ago, Burkina Faso. Landlocked, often overlooked, and until recently described only in terms of poverty or unrest. But something has changed. This nation, one of the poorest by economic standards, has become the epicenter of a new kind of resistance. Not violent, not loud, but strategic. A resistance that says we will not be managed, indebted, or dictated to. Burkina Faso has faced pressure on every front. After choosing to remove foreign troops from its soil, it found itself isolated in trade, financially targeted, and increasingly vulnerable to both internal and external threats. Banks closed doors, military aid was frozen, regional alliances like ECOWAS threatened sanctions, terrorist attacks surged, and yet the government stood its ground. In the eyes of its young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso didn't need charity. It needed space. Space to think, to rebuild, and most importantly, to choose its own friends. So why North Korea? Perhaps the question reveals more about us than it does about them. Why is it acceptable for some countries to choose powerful partners, but when an African country does it, especially with an ally outside the traditional Western sphere, it's immediately labeled a threat? The truth is simpler. Burkina Faso wasn't looking for ideology. It was looking for protection, fast, loyal, and unconditional. A shield, not a sermon. And the West, for the first time, it watched as an African government didn't ask for permission and didn't follow the script. It's not about endorsing any outside government. It's about a nation that has been targeted, that has been told what to do for decades, saying enough. Burkina Faso may not have the strongest army, the biggest economy, or a seat at the global table. But what it does have now is a strategy, and sometimes strategy is louder than strength. This is not the first time a small nation said no, but it may be the first time Africa did it without apology. It began with whispers too quiet for headlines, too complex for sound bites. A strange drone appeared over the capital city of Ouagadougou. A confidential map of the presidential residence was found in the briefcase of a trusted officer. A nighttime assault on a radio station was narrowly stopped by security agents. These weren't isolated incidents. They were signals that something or someone wanted the transitional government in Burkina Faso removed. Over 6 months, intelligence sources within the country reported no fewer than 3 assassination attempts, not by rebels in the forest, not by foreign armies, but by men in suits and uniforms in boardrooms. Some were paid through offshore accounts. Others were moved by influence. The president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, responded the only way a young leader with few global allies could, by looking outside the conventional playbook. And in the shadows, he found a response from Pyongyang, not Paris, from a country long isolated but fiercely loyal. It's true, 700 trained commandos from North Korea landed in Burkina Faso, not under media fanfare, not through flashy parades. Quietly, purposefully, they didn't bring weapons of war, they brought something else: methods, systems, and yes, a different mindset. Their mission was outlined in 3 parts: protect the presidency, not in theory, but in every hallway, every public space, every potential weak point, secure critical infrastructure, military bases, gold refineries, and the country's new communication system. Train a new generation not for conquest, but for awareness. To detect betrayal not by ideology, but by patterns, strange bank transactions, sudden travel, unusual meetings. This wasn't a mercenary operation. There were no checks exchanged through global banks, no contracts published in Parliament. It was something older, a strategic agreement born not out of desperation, but recognition. Both countries had been pressured. Both had survived by preparing for isolation. Was it risky? Absolutely. But perhaps no risk was greater than doing nothing. Burkina Faso is not the only African nation that's faced instability from within. Generals tempted by briefcases of foreign cash industries sold quietly to companies with no flag. What makes this story different is that someone finally said, "We will not let this happen again," not quietly, not blindly. Still, the move didn't go unnoticed. International media outlets quickly called it a dangerous pivot. Think tanks wrote op-eds about a dictatorial turn, and former diplomats warned of sanctions, trade restrictions, or worse. But in the capital city, many citizens felt something different: relief. Not because they welcomed secrecy, but because they had seen too many governments fall from the inside, and this time someone was watching the doors. Was it perfect? No. Was it normal? Definitely not. But for a country that had been the subject of more headlines about poverty than potential, this was a story of agency. A moment where leadership didn't mean looking east or west, but looking inward and asking, what do we protect and who do we trust to help us protect it? Let's be clear. This isn't a celebration of military presence. It's not about North Korea. It's about Burkina Faso refusing to play by a script that says African nations must always wait for permission, for aid, for protection. Traoré's government may be young, but it has chosen clarity over comfort. And what about those who criticize this move? Their concern is valid. History has shown that secrecy can lead to suppression, that militarization can backfire. But the deeper issue lies not in the method, but in the double standard. When powerful countries station troops around the world, it's called security. When an African country does it, it's called dangerous. When Western governments support their allies with elite forces, it's strategy. When Burkina Faso does the same, it's a threat. So ask yourself, is this really about who protects or who's allowed to? The shadows in this case may not be where the danger lies. Sometimes the real threat is the silence that follows every destabilized country. The shrug that comes when coups succeed, in the headlines that fade when promises of democracy vanish without warning. This time, the government chose not to wait for that story to unfold. We don't choose our allies for how they look on television. We choose them based on whether they show up when no one else will. A senior Burkinabe advisor speaking off the record, and that may be the most radical idea of all, that a small nation surrounded by uncertainty can still choose, not because it's reckless, but because it has learned real security isn't given, it's built. When 700 uniformed men stepped off that plane in Burkina Faso, the world focused on the boots, the uniforms, the insignias, but it missed what truly matters. What arrived wasn't just a military unit. It was a new mindset, one that sees trust as the highest currency in a world of shifting alliances, and it forced a difficult question into the open. Who do you trust to protect your future when your past has been shaped by betrayal? For decades, Burkina Faso, like many African nations, was told to trust international partnerships, to depend on foreign advisors, foreign banks, and foreign trained forces. But in moment after moment, those systems failed. Elections manipulated, resources extracted, presidents overthrown, often in silence sometimes, with whispers of outside influence. So when Ibrahim Traoré looked beyond the usual partners, he wasn't searching for ideology. He was looking for consistency, a relationship without lectures, assistance without conditions, and in that moment, the logic wasn't geopolitical, it was personal. Because if you've ever stood on ground you didn't control, you know that protection is more than a defense plan. It's a moral decision. And here's what many didn't see. While the world debated the optics of North Korean troops, over 2,000 Burkina Faso civilians were quietly trained in civil defense, local security, and community surveillance. These weren't war preparations. They were resilience programs, helping citizens recognize infiltration, detect corruption in their own institutions, and build parallel networks of communication that couldn't be hacked or hijacked. No longer waiting for foreign intelligence, no longer waiting for satellite updates from a continent away, just people defending what they've built. And that is what truly unnerved global observers. It wasn't the soldiers, it was the strategy. Because history has taught us something dangerous. A population that can defend itself, not just militarily, but mentally, is much harder to manipulate. So, while analysts speculated about covert missions and rogue alliances, something else was happening on the ground. Students began helping professors develop localized encryption tools. Retired soldiers returned to train the next generation in how to guard infrastructure from farms to data centers. A group of young coders created what they called the Traoré Network, an independent broadcast signal that bypasses international controls, supported by Venezuelan infrastructure and protected from surveillance. Was this perfect? No. But it was real. And what mattered most wasn't the foreign uniforms, it was that Burkina Faso had chosen to no longer outsource its trust. When stories broke about the neutralization of over a dozen internal plots, few outside the country asked who was behind them, who planted listening devices inside government cars, who funded encrypted communication hubs off the coast of Europe, who offered millions to a general in exchange for access. The answers are still unclear, but the reaction was not. In silence, not with press conferences or social media threads, the government began tracking financial flows, monitoring travel patterns, identifying pressure points. And that information didn't flow to the outside world. It flowed inward, into a growing map of vulnerability, not to blame citizens, but to finally protect them. Because when betrayal lives inside your own institutions, defense is not just about standing guard. It's about understanding the patterns of harm and building structures that can't be bought, borrowed, or broken from the outside. Many call this paranoia, but others, especially those who've lived through the Cold War, through surveillance scandals, through government overreach, might see it differently. You remember COINTELPRO. You remember the fear in the 60s and 70s when speaking up could mean being watched. So maybe you also understand why some countries long ignored now seek to protect their people in ways that may seem extreme, but to them are necessary. In the case of Burkina Faso, it's not about building a perfect nation overnight. It's about building one that doesn't fall overnight. And that's the hidden truth. The most powerful shift wasn't the arrival of commandos. It was the arrival of confidence. Confidence that a country could still defend itself even when powerful voices told it otherwise. Confidence that trust, when built from within, is stronger than the most advanced weapons sent from abroad. And that kind of confidence, not ideology, not aid, is what's most threatening to a global system built on compliance. Burkina Faso has made its choice, not out of rebellion, not out of fear, but out of memory. The kind of memory every people share when they've lived through broken promises and learned the hard way what protection really means. And if we're honest, if we look beyond the headlines, maybe the question isn't whether this was the right move. Maybe the question is, what took so long? When the news first broke, the headlines followed a predictable pattern. Burkina Faso aligns with North Korea, a dangerous new axis, authoritarian shadows in West Africa. But behind the headlines, something else was happening quietly, steadily, and without permission. Burkina Faso was building a fortress, not of stone, not of weapons, but of systems. And not to start a war, but to end dependence. Across the north of the country, once fractured by insurgent violence, a secure base emerged. Not a secret bunker, but a strategic center for training young officers in rapid response cyber defense and civil infrastructure protection. It was called Fortress Black Knight. To the outside world, it looked like a military installation, but inside, it was much more. It was a campus where lessons were taught on how to secure hospitals from sabotage, how to protect local food supply chains, how to detect economic pressure points before they collapse an entire community. The message was clear: sovereignty isn't just about borders, it's about resilience. And with that resilience came results. Since the arrival of the Enhanced Security Program, and yes, including the North Korean unit Burkina Faso, has disrupted 13 coordinated plots targeting government officials and infrastructure, dismantled espionage cells that had existed since the colonial era, frozen over a dozen foreign-linked bank accounts, some connected to efforts to manipulate national contracts and election logistics. Most notably, a threat known internally as Operation Falling Star was stopped just hours before it was set to unfold. It was designed to detonate an explosive under a public stage, the same stage where President Traoré was scheduled to speak during Independence Day celebrations in front of 50,000 citizens. The explosive was found disabled and removed without panic, without press. The agents who discovered it never went on television. They didn't take credit, but the government knew. And more importantly, the people knew. That's the kind of protection that builds trust. And here's the deeper shift. None of these actions happened through foreign embassies or outsourced consultants. They happened because Burkina Faso invested in its own human capital. Young analysts, former teachers turned data reviewers, veterans turned mentors. The new Defense Academy, built with assistance from allies in Mali, Venezuela, and yes, North Korea, is already training the next wave of leaders. But not to become soldiers in someone else's war. They're being trained to ensure that no future government ever has to beg for protection or silence itself just to stay safe. Still, consequences arrived. International aid packages were suspended. A diplomatic warning came from Washington. Some European partners froze partnerships on development projects. But the country did not collapse. Why? Because when you don't tie your survival to approval, you begin to build differently. Grain shipments now arrive from Venezuela under a barter agreement, exchanging food for minerals and medical supplies. No need for dollars, banks, or clearance codes. New encryption systems developed with help from open source communities and regional allies now bypass external surveillance entirely. Meetings once vulnerable to leaks are now secure not through secrecy, but through self-reliance. And in the countryside, farmers who once feared displacement from foreign-owned mining contracts are now building cooperative businesses with legal protections backed by national defense. What changed Burkina Faso didn't just build walls, it built awareness. That's the essence of the fortress. It isn't about isolation. It's about insulation from manipulation, from dependency, from erasure. In a world that often expects African nations to wait for instruction, the real disruption was not the presence of foreign commandos. It was the absence of fear. We do not need to be told how to survive, one farmer in the outskirts of Kaya said. We just need the space to try. That space has come at a cost, but it has also come with clarity. Burkina Faso is not preparing for war. It is preparing to never need to be rescued again. In the traditional playbook of international diplomacy, image often wins over substance. A country is deemed trustworthy if it fits the mold, if its leaders speak in polished sound bites, if its institutions mirror Western models, and if its military partners wear the right uniforms. But Burkina Faso is rewriting that playbook, and it's asking a radical question. What if loyalty mattered more than image? In today's world, alliances are often formed not by trust, but by optics. A handshake with a G7 leader is seen as legitimacy. A loan from a multinational bank signals progress. A base shared with a global power is considered security. But for nations like Burkina Faso, those images have not brought protection. They've brought expectation without empowerment. For decades, African governments were encouraged, even pressured, to open markets, accept structural reforms, and follow external timelines. In return, they were promised development, peace, and partnership. Yet, time after time, when political crises erupted or violence broke out, those promises were slow to arrive or disappeared entirely. So, when Burkina Faso chose to partner with countries like North Korea or Venezuela, it wasn't because they wanted to reject the West. It was because they wanted a different kind of relationship, one not built on conditions, but commitment. It's important to note this isn't about politics. It's about priorities. The question isn't, is this the ideal partner? It's who will stand by you when others won't. And the answers, it turns out, are changing the map of Africa. In recent years, Mali, Niger, and Guinea have made similar moves, reshaping their defense strategies, renegotiating natural resource contracts, and distancing themselves from decades-old arrangements that no longer reflect their reality. These decisions have invited criticism, sanctions, suspensions from regional bodies. But they've also sparked something else, a conversation across the continent. One that asks, why must Africa always get permission before acting? Why are certain alliances labeled dangerous even when they protect national interests? Why is sovereignty applauded elsewhere but questioned here? The answer many are beginning to believe lies in control. Not the kind exercised through tanks or speeches, but the quiet control of access to loans, to global forums, to the bandwidth of international attention. Burkina Faso's approach breaks that pattern. By turning to unconventional partners, they've signaled something deeper, that dignity matters more than visibility. And the strategy goes even further. Take the communication system known internally as the Traoré Network, a collaboration between Burkina Faso developers and Venezuelan engineers. It bypasses external platforms and allows secure local broadcasting and communication. This isn't isolationism, it's insulation from the kind of narrative control that has historically painted African movements as chaotic, irrational, or regressive. Now, for the first time, a country like Burkina Faso can tell its story on its terms, through its own frequencies. And that shift from being spoken about to speaking for itself is, perhaps, the most strategic move of all. Let's be honest. Not every country will agree with this model. Not every government should adopt it wholesale. But what Burkina Faso is demonstrating is this sovereignty is not about rejecting the world. It's about refusing to be reshaped by it without consent. The use of North Korean support, while controversial, isn't about copying ideology. It's about tapping into a form of resilience born out of necessity. The same way Cuba survived isolation. The same way Vietnam rebuilt after devastation. The same way South Korea decades ago once relied on American presence before charting its own future. Every nation has its phase of survival, and those phases often involve difficult choices. Burkina Faso is in one of those phases now. But what makes this different, what makes it strategic, is the clarity behind the chaos. There is no confusion about who's in charge. There is no illusion of perfect allies. There is only purpose. That's why even under scrutiny, even facing pressure from powerful institutions, the country continues to move forward, building, protecting, and above all, learning. And the continent is watching, because if Burkina Faso can secure its data, protect its leaders, train its people, and manage its resources without waiting for approval, what else is possible? That is the real question being asked in the halls of power, not just in Africa, but across the globe. Because once you prove that loyalty, not legacy, can build a nation, the old frameworks begin to crumble. And that more than anything is why the world is paying attention. Not because Burkina Faso has picked a side, but because for the first time in decades, it has drawn its own line. If you once marched for civil rights in Selma, If you questioned the war in Vietnam while watching the news unfold in black and white, if you stood against apartheid, spoke out during Watergate, or simply believed America should be a force for fairness in the world, then you understand this moment. You understand what it means to live in a world where small voices are often drowned out, where power is mistaken for wisdom, where nations are told to be grateful even as their choices are taken away. Burkina Faso may be far from your home. Its president may not speak in the polished language of diplomacy. Its alliances may make you pause. But listen closely, not to the headlines, but to the heartbeat beneath them. It's the same rhythm that once pulsed through Montgomery buses, through college campuses during anti-war protests, through every moment when people stood up and said, "We choose dignity, even when it costs us." Burkina Faso is not asking for applause. It's asking for understanding. That sovereignty, the right to exist, to decide to build, should never come with conditions. So we ask not as adversaries, but as fellow human beings. If you've ever believed in justice, then now is the time to remember why.